Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending OneSource's IT Spotlight Series webcast. My name is Kirk Waddell. I'm the Executive Vice President of Technology at OneSource, and I'm thrilled to introduce my colleague and friend, Chris Hope. Chris is the Senior Director of IT and Security here at OneSource. Chris has a tremendous amount of experience and history in the information technology and IT service industry and is skilled in IT leadership, public, private, hybrid cloud, virtualization, product development, and IT outsourcing. His focus is on IT leadership and translating business needs into IT service deliverables, both with an organization and for an IT managed service customer. Chris, I had to read that because I didn't want to mess that up because that's just way too good stuff to get that wrong. So anyway, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, excited to be here. Sorry for the mouthful of a bio, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, very well deserved. So Chris, as you know, like during this series, we've been discussing various ways in which IT leaders can really maximize their budgets in what is a very difficult time right now. And so with the impact of the pandemic and transition to remote workforce for a lot of organizations, including ours, agility is of the utmost importance. And so having the ability to have a fluid IT infrastructure that generates greater productivity, efficiency, and competitive advantage during this time of crisis is still of the utmost importance, I think, for not only IT leaders, but certainly business leaders themselves. And so, bottom line is the demand for innovation is not going to change. CEOs are still going to have the same expectations of their IT teams to continue that innovation, to make them relevant, right, in their respective businesses. But being mindful of obviously the current constraints of budget. So that's kind of the focus of our discussion today. So it'll be critical strategies for IT innovations for our budget in 2021. So excited to talk about this topic with you, Chris. And I know this is something that you have just a tremendous amount of experience in, and I know our viewers will get a lot of benefit from this. Real quickly before we get started, just a quick Q&A or a quick housekeeping thing from my side. We will do Q&A at the end of the webinar, so you should see the Q&A box in the middle of your screen. So by all means, as Chris is going through this information, if you have a question, please register it there, and then with the remaining time at the end of our webinar, we will try to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. So Chris, let's dig in. This will be like talking shop, so I'm excited about this one. So let's first of all let's talk about the trends. What were the top trends in 2020, and really what are the important things to know as we transition from 2020 into 2021?
Yeah, I want to touch on something you said in setting up the topic that I think is pretty important. You said that innovation continues, and executive leadership is going to expect the same innovation from IT departments that we had in good economic times, even in bad. But the reality is they actually expect more because now IT is no longer a cost center that you can allocate funds to. It has to be something that actively drives keeping the business afloat. It has to be something that contributes to the success of the business in every way. And if it's not doing that, it's not going to be successful. So innovation is actually accelerating now in a little bit tougher economic times because IT has to get in front of the business needs, has to solve the problems before they become a cost burden to the rest of the business. So thinking about the things that can drive cost burden, Jonathan and Mary had a really good opportunity in the earlier webinar sessions to talk about telecommunications and how you can find cost savings there. Interestingly enough, that's one of the things that's changing the most rapidly over the past 2 years and expects to continue to do so in the coming year. SD-WAN. SD-WAN is a technology that allows you to run a connectivity between your offices without having to buy private circuits. So you don't have to buy an MPLS circuit between every office location. You can use your plain old internet service and have secure encrypted communications between your offices. And you don't have to manage all those individual VPN tunnels the way you would on a legacy infrastructure. That is up 44% over the past couple of years and is expected to continue to grow pretty significantly. The reality is you're saving telecom expense, you're saving overhead, and you're setting yourself up for future expansion into new markets as the economy improves.
And Chris, in certain ways, maybe even improving the topology of the network itself in certain
100%.
In certain situations.
Lower failure rates and better quality of service for your users. It's a win-win because you're solving a financial problem at the same time you're solving a business problem. There are no sacrifices with SD-WAN. You don't have to pick and choose which priority. You actually get the better of both options.
No question. One thing there, because we always talk about buzzwords, right? Because our industry is just full of them, right? And SD-WAN has been the buzz now but I will say it's the actual adoption rate of SD-WAN as compared to other buzzwords, such as even UCaaS adoption, even cloud-based adoption, which I know you're going to expand on. It actually, the adoption rate from an SD-WAN standpoint seems to be accelerating exponentially, as opposed to perhaps some of those other cool buzz phrases that we've had in previous iterations. To your point, I think that adoption rate is going to continue to skyrocket.
Yeah, from a survey that was done in January, almost half of current enterprise companies have already adopted SD-WAN. So we're reaching that point of, if you're not doing it, you're getting behind at this point.
No doubt.
Speaking of cloud, that actually ties in well to the next thing I wanted to bring up, which is cloud adoption continues to grow really strongly, even with the pandemic as it has been and the economic depression. Cloud spending on public cloud is up 6.3% this year from Gartner. That was a statistic that they released in June. So even with businesses struggling, even with closure of retail and certain effects on the economy, total cloud spending is still up this year, which surprised me. I mean, quite honestly, that we would continue to see growth in that industry. And that just tells you how many more people are adopting the platform than have had to shut their doors, right? We're seeing such strong growth and adoption that it's more than offsetting any recession that's happening in that industry. When we talk about cloud, there's lots of different strategies. You can have private cloud, running it into data center that's maybe close to your office. You can have public cloud. There's the big players, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud are the big three. Or you can have what we like to call multi-cloud, which is you do some of column A and some of column B. Interestingly enough, 93% of companies surveyed by Flexera in 2020 are looking at multi-cloud as their preferred strategy. And there's a really good reason for that, is that some workloads translate really well to being run in private cloud data center. Some workloads translate really well to being run in public cloud. And most businesses have both. The reality is that you're probably not going to be doing all of column A or all of column B. You're going to need to mix and match a little bit to be able to get the most efficient use out of your infrastructure. TechJury put out a survey earlier this year as well, where they were looking at public cloud adoption. And what they found is that in addition to that multi-cloud strategy, most companies are moving not just dev test, but they're actually moving their enterprise workloads into public cloud as well. So they found that 67% of enterprise workloads are expected to transition into cloud before the end of the year. And that's pretty incredible, because the early 2010s, cloud was still a lot of dev test. It was, what the big companies, the Fortune 100s did, but smaller enterprises.
And it's what we all like to talk about, right?
Yeah, well, we do, but most of us don't work for that company, right? Most of us don't work for the 5,000 pound gorilla. We work for a small enterprise. And so thinking about that in the big picture term this is being done in the small enterprise too. And there's lots of really good reasons why, which we'll get into as we go through the webinar today. But it's not just for the big boys anymore. All of us have the opportunity to realize more effective management, better cost savings by looking at some of these options. And then the other thing to mention as far as trends and where things are headed, you brought up UCaaS earlier on, and I think that's a good one to touch on as well, because we have seen a massive shift to UCaaS since March of this year. And everybody knows what that's from, right? Everybody's working from home. We got to get web conferencing. We got to get Zoom or WebEx or whatever your preferred platform is, but we have to get our people to be able to collaborate remotely. So the growth in that sector has just been crazy. I mean, it's 300% increases across the board in those platforms, but that's not going to go away. What we're realizing now as we get through the back half of 2020 is that this is not a one and done kind of exercise. This is not we're all going to go back to 100% in the office in the future. This is the new normal for a lot of businesses. There are businesses that are planning on keeping remote work in perpetuity, or at least through mid or late 2021. So you're talking about multiple years of investment in a platform to allow for better collaboration for your employees that are not in a physical office.
Those are all interesting points, and from a specifically from a UCAS standpoint, we're really from across the board standpoint. I think the although as certainly as terrible as the pandemic has been, I really think that it has brought home some of the key selling points in which people in the tech industry have been beating the drum for a while. That's in that around the area of business continuity, not a matter of if but when. And unfortunately in this particular scenario, this is something that's impacting all aspects, all areas of the country, not just a specific region due to weather, things of that nature. And so yeah, it's just really interesting to see that at least we have the technologies in place, right, to adapt to the current situation that we're in. So let's move away from that and talk about allocating IT budget for growth and flexibility. And obviously, it's critical to support upgrades in IT infrastructure. So can you discuss some of the best strategies that you recommend when it comes to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's really four key strategies when we talk about budget allocation, because everybody's being asked to do more right now. Every IT department in the world is being asked to do more. And most of us are being asked to do more with less financial resources, less people resources. So framing it in that context is, how do we drive innovation? How do we get better? How do we push the business forward while not increasing our spend or sometimes even recovering cost? We've got four key strategies to talk about today. The first is avoiding vendor lock-in. And what I mean by that is, you want to make sure no matter what technology you shop for, whether that's a networking technology, an SD-WAN technology, a cloud technology, you want to make sure that you have flexibility to shop the market. The reality is that all vendors, all partners will go through change, will go through price increases, will go through evolutions of their business model over time. You need to make sure that if one of your vendors or partners makes a pivot that no longer aligns with what you're trying to do, what your goal and mission is for your business, that you have the flexibility to make a change, go out and find an alternative in the industry. If you choose something that is so narrowly specific and doesn't translate outside of that one vendor, then you may be locked in and you're stuck with them, good, bad, or ugly. So avoiding vendor lock-in and looking for cross compatibility, looking for open source opportunities, looking for platforms that play nicely with others and provide good integrations, that sets you up for future success to be able to make that pivot if and when you need to. For the second strategy, we want to look at options that integrate security. It's no surprise to anyone. I think everyone who works in IT knows this. Cybersecurity is expensive. Doing security in IT is expensive. And so what you want to look for is platforms, systems, architectures that have planned for security to be baked in from the very beginning. Because if you're building out a cloud platform or a UCaaS platform, an SD-WAN, right? It doesn't matter what. If you're building out an infrastructure platform for your business, and then you have to layer on event monitoring, and you have to layer on analysis, and you have to layer on a security operations group or an incident management team, you're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional spend to make that platform secure and to make sure that you're not putting your business in a position to be breached. So looking for platforms that provide those functions and features already bundled in, already part of the platform, so that you know that those are baked in, they're being considered, and you're in a better position to set your business up for a secure performance. That's really key. And that will drive massive cost savings when you're looking at adoption. We talked a lot about vendor lock-in, but the third point also comes back to flexibility around your business needs. So when we think about vendor lock-in, it's flexibility around choice of vendors. But third point is really around flexibility for how your business changes and what its needs are compared to other parts of the industry. The reality is that the IT needs of a manufacturing company don't look anything like the IT needs of a software development shop, right? Those are completely different worlds when you talk about IT infrastructure. Manufacturing is about stability, performance, uptime, reliability. Software development is about speed, agility, quick testing, quick teardown, right? And so the design that you build for one company is not going to be the design that you build for the next. And you need to have the awareness as an IT leader to come back and say, what are the key things that my business needs to be successful? What are the key values that I'm bringing to this IT group to say, all right, our number one thing is uptime. If we go down, it costs us hundreds of thousands of dollars a minute. So I want to make sure that uptime is prioritized above all else. Okay, well, that sets a standard that you judge everything else off of and sets a standard for all of your other choices. Or maybe your number one priority is agility. You want to be able to spin stuff up or down at a minute's notice. You want to be able to increase and decrease resources as consumption changes. Well, then that's a different standard that you're going to apply to all of your infrastructure and design choices across everything in your stack. And so taking the time up front to identify those needs and consider them will lead you to a path where you're making the best choices for the least cost. And where that really comes down to is we can't do it all, right? I would love to be able to say that everybody gets 9 nines or 7 nines of uptime, right? But that's not important for every business in the same way it is as others. So you think about certain segments, right? You've got financial services, you've got healthcare, you've got manufacturing. Uptime's really critical in those industries. But software development, service industries, it's not so important. So that may not be the key factor that you design around when you're looking at your IT budget. And then this is a kind of an interesting tip or trick. The fourth strategy here is really about how you engage with your vendors once you select them. So you find those cross-compatible, play nice with other vendors to avoid your vendor lock-in. You build in security from the ground up, and you evaluate the flexibility or values that you're bringing to IT. But then, so you've got your vendor, right? You know who you want to work with. You're like, okay, I know that I'm going to buy from X. Look at what their options are for the buying program. It sounds like such a trivial thing, but it's something that too few of us think about, especially in the cloud space.
Right.
When we talk about cloud, everybody thinks month to month. Right? 100% of conversations are around month to month because that's the way it's been ingrained in us. That's all we've heard from the marketing teams of these cloud departments and these companies is month to month.
Swipe and go.
Yeah. Credit card, and we'll just bill you for utility billing. We'll bill you for what you use.
Yeah.
That's great for the company that wants agility and turning stuff up and down in a moment's notice and highly dynamic workloads that change from month to month. That's great for them. That's not great for a financial services company that has exactly the same utilization every single month of the year. And they don't spin things up and down at random, right? They have a very steady state operation. So they can approach that same cloud services company and they can say, what are my options for going into a contract term? And not enough people ask this question of their cloud providers, but they all have them. Every single big cloud provider out there has an option for a multi-year contract term. And the prices are dramatically lower. For example, we just negotiated on behalf of one of our customers for an Azure environment. And by getting them, they're a financial services company, by getting them into a 3-year contract term for their Azure environment, we were able to save them 46% compared to the standard month-to-month rate. So that's almost half off the top of the price, just by agreeing with that cloud services company that, hey, we know pretty much what our utilization looks like. So we'll just plan it over the next 3 years. We'll buy at that level. And we're going to take a huge amount of cost off the top of that deal by doing so.
Yeah, it's one of those things that they cross their fingers and hope you don't ask. I really, it's all that was really helpful, Chris. I think, one of the mistakes that customers make is they fall into the trap of allowing the vendors and the solution providers to dictate the solution that's best for them, as opposed to the customer dictating the solution that fits best for them. So, I think if there's a nugget I could pull out of what you just went over, that's really it. Fight for your business needs. Don't allow the providers and vendors to try to corner you into what best fits their product scope. So let's move on to speaking more on cloud. And so what are some tips and tricks? Sometimes it just seems like this, we always say it just seems like this big, oblivious thing when we talk about cloud that we don't even really know how to really provide a description of it. But what are some secrets and things when it comes? And I think people just think that cloud is cloud. I take it as is, but I think you've got some great tips on things to consider with cloud platforms and technologies that would be beneficial for the audience.
Yeah, I do have a few tips and tricks, and what we call dirty little secrets of cloud that providers don't like to advertise. But I saw a great bumper sticker driving around Raleigh the other day, and it said, "There is no cloud. It's just somebody else's computer." And when you boil it down, I mean, that's all cloud is, right? That's somebody else is running the infrastructure for you instead of you putting it in a server closet. It's just somebody else's computer. So it's not as crazy complicated as people think it is.
Right.
But there are some interesting things that I want to talk through and make sure that we talk about. So when we think about public cloud versus private cloud versus traditional infrastructure for a business, they are very different from a budgeting, planning, and allocation design standpoint. You're not going to contract public cloud the same way that you would build out server infrastructure in a closet in your office. And so having that time and planning to be able to back up and say, okay, we talked about this. What are the needs of my business? What are the things I care about first? And let me drive the architecture around that. And as we said, so many companies are adopting hybrid now as an option of saying, okay, this part of my business is highly dynamic and maybe makes sense to run in public cloud, but this other part of my business is not. So I'm going to look at a hybrid cloud model where I split that stuff up and I put portions of my business in public cloud. I run portions of it on my premise and portions of it maybe in a data center. And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with considering doing that. It's not the all in, I have to plan for everything IT needs in one place that it used to be. And honestly, we talked about SD-WAN. SD-WAN is a big part of why. You put an SD-WAN appliance in your data center, you put a virtual SD-WAN appliance in your public cloud, they're connected. You don't have to worry about buying circuits or bandwidth like you used to. That has evolved in the last few years to enable that multi-cloud strategy to be really, really successful. But you also can't go into public cloud and treat it exactly the way you did with your on-premise infrastructure 10 years ago. This is one of the biggest surprises to people when they get into public cloud for the first time is if they build their public cloud environment exactly the same way they would have built it on their office, their on-site infrastructure, they will spend more money.
Yeah,
it's not something people like to talk about, but if you treat public cloud like on-premise infrastructure, it costs more because you are paying another company to run those other person's computers for you, right? And that is not free. Where you can realize legitimate cost savings is when we think about the use case and how you determine what is suited for which environment. So talk about financial services, very, very, very flat usage, very steady state. Public cloud is not always a great fit for them because what you end up with is you don't have a benefit from the flexibility that public cloud gives you compared to that small increase in cost of doing it yourself. But when you're in a company that is changing your needs rapidly, you have developers who are building out test environments. You have a service group that has massive peak volume around the holidays and then drops off on Jan 1 and needs almost no resources, right? Those are use cases where you can add resources as necessary in your public cloud. You can build up, and then when the resource utilization drops, you can drop it right back down. In traditional infrastructure, you had to plan for those peaks. You had to buy all of this equipment, the server, the network, the storage. You had to plan for your high watermark of utilization. In cloud, you don't have to do that. You can plan for your average watermark. And then when you have seasonal variations, you just spin up more resources, spin down more resources. And so you can accommodate those peaks for much less expensive than you could do in a traditional infrastructure of having to set your capital purchase at that high watermark.
Right.
And that's where cloud really realizes cost savings, is that flexibility piece. And again, don't treat it like traditional on-premise IT. Don't set your cloud environment for your high watermark. Let it scale for you. That's the huge benefit of using it. The other thing that I think companies sometimes forget when they're looking at cloud adoption for the first time is the skill set. The reality is that the skills that it takes to manage on-premise server infrastructure don't translate 100% over to the skills that are required to manage a cloud environment. 70% overlap, I think, is pretty accurate. I mean, a lot of the technology is the same. There's still Windows servers, there's still Linux servers, they're still running the same apps, but your networking is different, your security groups are different, your policy enforcement is different, how you create and destroy machines is different. So there's a different training, different expertise required to successfully manage a cloud environment compared to an on-premise environment. I have an example from a customer that I talked to a little while back who was doing cloud themselves. They accidentally put one of their servers in front of the firewall instead of behind the firewall. Now, can you imagine doing that in an office infrastructure? Can you imagine like, oh, I'm just going to unplug my firewall from the cable modem and plug it directly into a server? That's not going to happen. You can't make those mistakes on traditional infrastructure, but you can make those mistakes in the cloud. And it's very, very easy to do without even realizing that it happened. Now, fortunately, caught it very quickly, no repercussions from this, but that's the kind of mistake that if it didn't get caught could expose your company to really, really terrible breaches, ransomware, all sorts of nasty stuff from cyber criminals. So there's a lot of risk if you're going into it with a skill set that doesn't translate. And so having a partner to bring into that conversation to say, you know, I know my application stack, I know what my business needs to be able to run, but I don't yet know cloud. How can I get there? That's where a partner can step in and really guide you through that journey and help you with that transition into a new technology. One more thing to talk about is virtual desktop. So virtual desktop is a really interesting use case and was very niche before 2020. You know, it didn't have momentum because the reality is that putting a desktop inside a data center is more expensive than putting a desktop on the laptop in front of you. The laptop hardware costs less. There's no way to sugarcoat that. It does.
Right.
But what do you do when every single one of your employees is now working from home and their laptop isn't on the corporate network anymore? Do you give them all VPN access? Well, maybe, but that carries tremendous risk in and of itself. Or do you look at something like virtual desktop? So 2020 has been a massive shift for virtual desktop infrastructure. We call it VDI for short, virtual desktop infrastructure. And many more companies are adopting that as a platform now due to the reality of remote work, due to the reality of dispersed units, people not sitting in the corporate office anymore, but wanting to enable them to be able to work as if they were in the corporate office. So in that model, your desktop, your servers, your infrastructure is all running inside cloud, be it private or public. And now your connection from home is simply screen share and keyboard strokes, right? It's not data transfer. There is no private corporate data on your laptop anymore. All of that stays within the data center, and all that you get is the screen draw and the keyboard and mouse on the local version. So some of the things that companies had to do for compliance in previous years of, you know, I have to go push BitLocker to every single one of my Windows laptops, or I have to go push, you know, full disk encryption down to every single computer in my org because every one of them has access to this file server that contains corporate sensitive information. Not in VDI. VDI is natively encrypted in the cloud. So you shortcut that requirement because now your laptop that you hand to your user doesn't have to even be a laptop anymore. It can be an iPad, it can be a Chromebook, it can be something that's just a little dumb terminal. As long as it can do screen draws and keyboard and mouse, it gives the ability for the user to do their work as if they were sitting in a corporate office, but they can do it from anywhere in the world. And that's never been more important than 2020.
Yeah, talk about the perfect use case. We're in it right now, that's for sure. So Chris, great information. Really appreciate you taking the time to share that with our audience today. I do have one question that I'll get to quickly, as I know that we're at 2:30 and I want to be mindful of people's time, but historically, one of the major concerns as it related to cloud adoption was in and around the behavior of certain applications within the cloud. Is that, is that still, is that more of an urban legend now, and we're just bringing that forward, or is that still something that really needs to be accounted for when you're designing your model? To your point, whether you want to go with a hybrid model of both private and cloud based, is that still a consideration that people should be thinking about?
It is a consideration, right? That consideration still exists, but it's not the consideration that it used to be. It used to be a tremendous roadblock. And especially the software vendors were very opposed to cloud environments because they didn't know how they would behave. They weren't comfortable yet with the model. And so they wouldn't certify their software to run in cloud environments. The shift for that has now happened, and more vendors for software are falling into the mentality of, oh, it's just somebody else's computer, right? It's still the same Windows server that he's got in the office. It's just running in somebody else's data center now. So you do have to be mindful of it. Check with your software vendors, validate that running in a cloud environment isn't going to cause any supportability or like contract issues. Every now and then, especially with the very small or niche software vendors, they will have basically a clause saying if you're running this in a cloud, you're running unsupported and we won't give you support. Very uncommon, but it's worth checking. Beyond that, beyond those software vendors that are not participating in the ecosystem, it's just somebody else's computer, right? The Windows server that you've got in your office is virtually identical to the Windows server that you're going to deploy in public cloud. The only difference is what hardware it's running on and who owns that hardware. But the Windows layer, it's all the same, and nothing really is different.
You really disappointed me because I thought it was this magic nebulous that I'd never witnessed before. So this is somewhat
It's
disheartening,
interesting
Chris.
because in the early 2000s, everybody talked about cloud native, right? That was the big buzzword, cloud native. So cloud native is the idea that, the application itself, if I'm deploying a web app, like a online ordering portal for my customers to buy stuff, that it self-heals and it spins up and down web servers and database servers as much as it needs to, and it dynamically grows. And the reality is that's about 5% of what runs in public cloud today is cloud native. Everything else that runs in public cloud today is traditional enterprise software, traditional enterprise workloads that are running on a traditional Windows or Linux server that just happens to be in the cloud.
Excellent. Awesome advice, Chris. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today. I think the information you've provided has been very beneficial to our audience. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. Just as a note, we will be sending out an email to all of those who registered for this webinar with a link back to the webcast. And within that email, if you have any feedback for us or topics that you would like for us to consider for future webinars, by all means, please provide that information to us. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. Please stay safe. Hope everyone has a great remainder of the week, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks.